So I got a really good piece of advice from one of my mentors who basically told me when you're doing like when you get into a job, whether it's part-time, full-time, just start taking notes on what you are enjoying and what you're not enjoying. Um, and I have a notebook. I've been keeping notes on every job I've had just in terms of the pros and cons of each. And within all three of the engineering co-ops I did, the cons list was always longer than the pros list. And so that kind of sparked that thought of, okay, maybe something isn't necessarily right here.
All right, Seth, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, sure. So I'm Saif. I'm a mechanical engineering graduate from UBC. Made a couple of career switches in my life, where most recently I jumped into marketing, and yeah, last week started in consulting. But outside of that, grew up in Dubai and Singapore. Spent a lot of time traveling the world, and now I'm here in Canada. So happy to be here.
I guess let's kick things off. Tell me about what inspired you to actually make the pivot. Like the first time you felt like, okay, I want to do something else.
Yeah, it's an interesting backstory where I was part of the co-op program. I know you're a big activist for being part of the co-op program, and yeah, I got started in that and tried to take on a bunch of different engineering jobs in a bunch of different industries to see what I liked within engineering. I kind of got into engineering thinking that that was the field I would enjoy, but as soon as I started doing those co-op jobs, I quickly realized actually maybe this isn't the field for me, there's something missing. That kind of prompted my search out into jobs outside of engineering. um, and I kind of landed on, okay, maybe I want to try to dive into the business world. And then the real question was, how do I make that happen?
Something that I got caught in with what you just said was that the fact that you realized you were missing something with like engineering or whatever your primary interest was at that time. How do you recognize that feeling?
So I got a really good piece of advice from one of my mentors who basically told me when you're doing like when you get into a job, whether it's part-time, full-time, just start taking notes on what you are enjoying and what you're not enjoying. Um, and I have a notebook. I've been keeping notes on every job I've had just in terms of the pros and cons of each. And within all three of the engineering co-ops I did, the cons list was always longer than the pros list. And so that kind of sparked that thought of, okay, maybe something isn't necessarily right here. The second piece of that really comes down to a gut feeling in the sense that you're doing your work, you're able to accomplish things, but, and I'm sure you can relate to this, when you're doing something you enjoy, it feels like time flies. Whereas when you're doing something you're not necessarily enjoying too much, it feels like the day is dragging on and on and on. You're kind of counting the minutes, counting the seconds, trying to get there. And so it really forced me to sit down and kind of consider obviously that pros and cons list, but also just consider whether or not I'm feeling fulfilled and accomplishing what I want to do in the spot that I'm in.
Let's talk about what someone today who wants to make a pivot, right, for whatever field that may be. What's something they can start with today if they know that they want to make the pivot?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think for me it comes down to really three core kind of things you can do. One thing I recommend everybody to start doing is, and I started doing this when I wanted to get that job in the business world, is writing my resume kind of like a plan where it's the end goal after the next 6 months. And it turns into almost that profile of like, okay, my resume needs to look like this for me to make it to my dream job. And I think that's really the one biggest piece of advice, that not only does it motivate you, but at the same time it tells you what, like it's almost like an exercise of saying what's missing in my resume, in my profile, that's going to get me to where I want to be, right? For example, for me, going from consulting into the marketing world, or from engineering, sorry, into the marketing world, I realized I don't actually have a lot of the soft skills in terms of the problem solving and really just that entire marketing profile. I hadn't done a case competition before. I hadn't really had any experience in the business world. For me, that really came down to, okay, where can I fill these gaps in my resume? How can I change my current experiences? And then putting down those skills tangibly and then saying, okay, now what am I going to do to actually, start building those skills? And that can be, again, similar to what I mentioned, courses, case comps, that kind of stuff. It even just a side project. And you start using that resume as your guide, but it's also keeping you accountable by saying, I want to achieve this within the next 6 months. And you really do what it takes to get there. There's a couple other things in terms of, I guess, how to get there. And I think The core two that I would say is first using the LinkedIn search feature. This is such a powerful tool in terms of figuring out what your profile really needs to look like. And I think you can even look at, like, you can go down to the detail of people who've graduated from my university, done my degree, and worked in a company that I used to work at, and then transitioned into the company I want to work at. And really being using that filtering can really help you identify those people in the space that have done a similar thing to you. Again, I think one important thing that I didn't realize was how common it was for engineers to transition out into the business world, whether that's marketing, consulting, etc. And it's almost comforting to know that regardless of what transition you're trying to make, there will always be somebody who has been in a similar situation. And whether you reach out to them or you just take a look at their profile, see how their work experience and their profile is developed on LinkedIn specifically, can really help you, understand some of the basics that it takes to get there. These are the people you have something in common with, which makes it a lot easier when you're reaching out to network with them. You're saying, hey, I noticed you made this transition, or I noticed you graduated from this university with this degree, but now you're working at company X. I'd love to talk to you about how you did that. 99% of the time, people will say yes because they love to share that knowledge. Again, this kind of the reason I'm also here on the podcast is that I feel like a lot of people who make that change wish that there were more resources out there to share. The second thing is really just start sharing your learnings. By creating content, you're immediately adding value to the space. When you create those posts, you're going to get feedback from other people who either have experience or have worked in the industry. They may comment on your post. They may even send you a DM about it, and you can turn it into a discussion, and that turns into a learning opportunity for you to learn and grow more within the space.
100%. And I want to also call out the point you made about reaching out to people on LinkedIn, right? I almost like didn't completely understand it the first time, because I was like, why would someone just take 30 minutes of their day to talk to me, because they know that ultimately all I want is that internship or that job. But in another example that really helped me understand that was when I moved to UBC. A lot of students back home who were my juniors would sometimes like find my number via my parents or their parents, and they'd reach out to me saying, "Hey, I want to apply to UBC and come study here. Can you tell me some tips, or like, can you tell me what it's like?" And at that point, you actually feel like helping that student. You want to tell them everything about your experience, things that you did right and went well, things mistakes you made, and also things that you didn't know. If you felt like you really wanted to help those students back home at that point, that's exactly the kind of feeling that you will be like giving to these alumni, so to say, who will help you out when you reach out to them.
Exactly, and I'll kind of piggyback on that and just say getting those small wins really helps you build a lot of confidence. And if you're afraid of taking that first step with maybe somebody who you're afraid will say yes or no, you have both of us who are very likely going to either reach out to you and have a great conversation with you, or we may even pass you off to one of our friends who has a better kind of experience that aligns with what you're trying to achieve. And so whether you reach out to us or not, I think it's a great idea to start getting those small wins, and we're definitely two people that'll be here to support you through that.
One last thing, or just one more thing I want to talk about is, in when we were discussing this earlier, you mentioned the idea of being patient, right? With whether it be with the pivot or with like the job search process. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, of course. And I think, again, I talk about being patient mainly because I think we're so used to getting instant results. This process of making a transition, whether it's right out of university or after a few years in a job you aren't necessarily too happy with, it takes time. And that's why I talked right at the beginning of this podcast about building that resume as a 6 month plan, where by the end of 6 months, I want to have those skills to make it. And so you have to be prepared to fail. Sometimes you're gonna be in the process of building this profile. You may even start to get some interviews, but you may not get the success you're looking for right away. And I experienced that a lot. I've failed about eight first round interviews, about four second round interviews, and a couple of final round interviews before finally getting that final job offer that got me into the industries I was looking to be part of.
Seth, thank you so much for being here, man. I really appreciate you not only being like detailed about your journey, but also being honest. And if you found this useful, definitely reach out to us. But right, thank you so much for tuning in to the UBC podcast.